Hey there people, how you doing? So today we have the video comparison between the S20 Plus and the Vivo X50 Pro. Now, there is a chance that the Vivo X50 Pro could be just as good as the S20 Plus's camera in terms of video quality because, well, maybe not quality per se, but the stabilization is something to be reckoned with because the gimbal stabilization system that the X50 Pro has, it's really something else, and it's basically hardware stabilization that the S20 Plus just doesn't have. And the Vivo X50 Pro, in terms of just stabilization alone, I have a feeling that it'll be in a league of its own, or maybe not. Maybe the differences will be so minor that it wouldn't even matter. Let's find out then, shall we? Alright, so this is a front camera video, and same story here, I guess, because once again we have no 4K options on the Vivo, but S20 does this very well because that 4K looks crispy. And yeah, I know that the 1080p on the front camera is not too bad, but 4K would be really nice to be standardized, That's something I'm really looking forward to, at least like in 2021 if you all survive. So, also, the audio icon will display which audio you're hearing right now. Alright, so over here, I think there are two ways you can look at this. First and foremost, the S20 Plus has a much higher resolution, so sharpness is better, and there is also a lot more grain on the S20 Plus for whatever reason. But another thing that the S20 Plus does really well are skin tones. You can see I look a lot better, a lot less pale on the S20 Plus. But the X50 Pro has its pros as well. It's got a lot less grain, which in this situation at least looks kind of better, I guess. And in terms of audio, I definitely think the S20 Plus is doing a far better job than the X50 Pro. So all in all, I'm going to pick the S20 Plus for selfie videos here. Now let's move on to the rear cameras because that's where the real fun's at. And here, as you can see, since I'm walking, there will be a little bit of jumpiness, and that is where the X50 Pro really shines because you can see the bobbing of the camera is a lot less than the S20 Plus, and that, in my opinion, is really impressive. That's where the gimbal camera really comes into its own, I guess. And even when I tilt up my hand and try to shoot my video with my arms completely outstretched, the number of jerks and jitters much less on the X50 Pro than on the S20. And of course, the S20 Plus is doing a fantastic job because, it's a great camera, but just in terms of stabilization, the X50 Pro does edge out just a little bit. The video quality, on the other hand, it's a different story, I guess, because the S20 Plus has a much lower contrast, so that's a different style of video, and the X50 Pro has a much higher contrast. So you'll be getting a lot more vibrance from the X50 Pro, while the S20 Plus might give you a little bit more dynamic range if you want to see it that way. But anyways, image quality wise, I'm going to call it a tie because it's really your preference here. I personally don't have any strong affection towards any of those particular styles, but yeah, whichever you like really. The stabilization though, I'm gonna give that hands down to the X50 Pro. But now we have the super steady modes on both, or ultra stable video on the X50 Pro. Now the resolution is limited to 1080p on both, but where the X50 Pro edges out a little is in frame rate. We can record up to 60 FPS on the X50 Pro, and it doesn't use the ultra wide angle camera because, let's admit it, we all know that ultra-wide-angle cameras aren't exactly the best things to be used for video, at least. And as you can see here, I think I overdid the number of jerks and jitters that I intentionally gave, but even so, I'd say stabilization is looking really good on both. I'd say almost equal because, the S20 Plus's super steady video is really something else, and the software is just incredible in that regard. But the X50 Pro, since it has the main camera that it can use for its ultra stable video, the quality of the video is actually a lot better on the X50 Pro. Now you might notice there's slight crop on the X50 Pro. That's because it's using the main camera, while the S20 Plus is actually using its ultra wide angle camera for that extra bit of stability. Speaking of which, now let's check out some ultra wide angle video, and admittedly it looks really good on both. I'd say at times the Galaxy S20 Plus does handle exposure a little better, while the X50 Pro sometimes tends to underexpose, but it's really not a major concern as such because, overall dynamic range is really good on both. Now we're checking out some zoom. This is all 4K obviously, and Zooming in 3 times, we can get pretty crisp details because we have a 64 megapixel camera on the S20 Plus, particularly for that very purpose. The details on the other hand, well, they're not that great, but it's a very far off zoom right there. I did zoom in all the way up to 10x and you can see the video quality is pretty bad. But flicking between preset zooms, there is a neat little animation that actually looks pretty damn nice. The X50 Pro on the other hand, it's got optical zoom. 2 cameras for that actually, 2 times and then again at 5 times. So obviously the quality of zoom on the X50 Pro is actually a little bit better than the S20 Plus here. Although the X50 Pro doesn't really have that slick zooming in and zooming out animation that the S20 Plus has. Now moving on indoors, and this shot that I keep in all my video comparisons, it's a really hard one actually because Valentine moves around a lot, obviously, and the tracking autofocus along with the moving camera, all those factors, that can lead to pretty spotty focusing. And I think it's pretty visible on the X50 Pro because you can see at times the focusing is kind of slow. It's not inaccurate as such, but it is kind of slow. As for the image quality in terms of sharpness when it is in focus, and other than that, the colors, dynamic range, all that, it's very similar to the S20 Plus. But of course, the lightning fast dual pixel autofocus on the S20 Plus, it's a really tough one to beat. Then again, the same can be said for Vivo in terms of stabilization because those small jitters that we get on the S20 Plus are just not there on the X50 Pro. It just smooths out the movement. Now one thing that I was pretty excited to check out was how the stabilization was in slight low light. Now of course you can try and use the S20 Plus in super steady mode, but as you can see, it's a disaster. Yeah, so I just switched it off and moved on to 4K. And there, it's not bad as such. There are a lot of grains obviously, but I do see a lot more jerks and jitters. It's like the electronic image stabilization is faltering a little more, mostly because I think there's a little less light available. But when we move on to the X50 Pro, since the stabilization mostly happens on a hardware level, well, I can say for sure the stabilization is just as good as in low light as it is in almost bright daylight. Now of course, stabilization isn't everything. The amount of grain you get at low light, the smudging of details, the spotty focusing, which is very evident on the X50 Pro, it's all there. Now of course, that will happen to most phones, but the fact that the X50 Pro is maintaining that amazing stabilization even in low light is something to be almost applauded. Now there is one thing that the S20 Plus can do that the X50 Pro just cannot. It's 8K video. And yeah, I don't know how much useful that really is because unless you're really into those documentary type talking videos where you're just sitting and the camera's on a tripod and you're just talking, I can't really see any other place to really use 8K because when using 8K, you have zero stabilization, the autofocusing is just bad. That's the best way I can put it. And of course, there's a lot of grain, a huge crop, all those factors come into play and really make 8K underwhelming. It really doesn't give us that higher quality and sharpness that we are supposed to see when recording 8K. Now I'm pretty sure you guys got a very good idea about the autofocusing on both the phones, but just for tradition, here's an autofocusing test. And as you can see, the S20 Plus is nearly flawless. The snappy and accurate autofocusing, the dual pixel autofocus, it's just pure bliss to even watch. Now the X50 Pro on the other hand, it's not bad. It's accurate enough, but it's not just that fast, that snappy, And it's not like it's bad as such, but compared to the S20 Plus, it kind of pales in comparison. Lastly, for some slow motion, you can see the X50 Pro does appear a little bit warmer, while the S20 Plus, not so much. Well, it's the X50 Pro that is actually more accurate. I did intentionally put a slightly warm light right beside the cameras before shooting, and the X50 Pro very accurately displayed the colors, while the S20 Plus, it tried to white balance it and made it look a lot more white than it really was. But of course, other than that, I do think that the X50 Pro appears to be slightly more soft than the S20 Plus. The overall sharpness of the S20 Plus that we get, it's a little bit more appealing in my opinion. So I'd say that the X50 Pro, although accurate, it doesn't have that amount of sharpness, while the S20 Plus has that amount of sharpness, while the colors are not that accurate. So I'm willing to call this one a tie. So that wraps up this kind of confusing video comparison. Now there are two schools of thought here, because on one hand, the S20 Plus, although not as good in stabilization, it kind of catches up with its higher overall quality and mainly the amount of sharpness, slightly lower contrast to give a slightly more, I guess, cinematic look. And overall, I think the image quality of the videos that the S20 Plus produces, they are a tad bit better than the X50 Pro. But of course, the X50 Pro, with its insanely good stabilization and that gimbal camera system overall, it just makes the Vivo so damn appealing, I mean, just the degree of stabilization that I can get, not only in daylight, but also when the lights go a little bit dim. Well, it's pretty phenomenal if you ask me. And although I'm not a huge fan of the extra contrast the X50 Pro gives us, but I am definitely a fan of how, although being a mid-ranger, it is able to stack up against the S20 Plus, and well, it is just so close in terms of quality as well. Of course, the S20 Plus is a little bit better, but you have to kind of pixel peep to really differentiate the two. But where the gap just widens even more is that the X50 Pro is not only a mid-ranger, but it is quite a few $100s cheaper than the S20 Plus. And so I do believe that the Vivo X50 Pro is actually a better camera for the price than the Galaxy S20 Plus. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, do hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be seeing you guys later. Cheers.